to Budget Dialogue session number 2. Et bon matin, bon après-midi à tous et tous. Si vous avez des questions en français, s'il vous plaît, mettez-le dans notre écran. On va faire de notre mieux pour vous répondre. Today's discussion is an opportunity to talk about the kinds of balancing and trade-offs that have to take place in order for the government to maintain fiscal responsibility while providing both the best possible programs and services and addressing our ongoing needs for infrastructure. Sometimes our infrastructure, indeed, is needed to deliver on our programs and services as well as promoting economic growth. This is also an opportunity to talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID-19 on our fiscal situation. And while COVID-19 certainly has disrupted the economy, both in the Northwest Territories and across Canada and indeed the world, there are signs of recovery. And thanks to the federal transfers and support that we've received over the last few months, the GNWT remains in reasonably good financial shape. We will be able to support economic recovery and also support the priorities of the Legislative Assembly over the coming budgets. There's 3 parts to today's presentation. The first section explains the interaction and relationships between the GNWT's 2 budgets, the operations budget and the capital budget. We will be speaking here to the challenge that exists between finding enough funds to pay for the capital plan while also maintaining the existing level of operations in terms of our services and programs. The second section describes some of the options that exist to develop our own source revenues. And last, we'll be giving some information and speaking to the economy as a whole, such as labor force data and employment data, and be looking for input on where and how to spend public funds in order to support the growth of a future Northwest Territories economy. After each of these sections, so throughout the presentation, I'll be pausing to take questions, answer some clarifying points, and also seek some input as we go. So we'll get started. The operating and the capital budgets. So I've certainly heard it said that there is the budget, as though it was one thing only, when in fact the GNWT does have 2 budgets. There's the capital budget and the operating budget. The capital budget deals with the expenditures for capital, so such as roads, bridges, buildings, schools. These are durable, they have a long life. The capital budget comes out in the fall of the previous fiscal year so that departments can have their contracts and supplies ready for April 1st. This fall, for example, the Assembly will be reviewing the 2021-22 capital budget. Now, the operating budget, this consists of the day-to-day spending for all programs and services. It also includes all of the GNWT's revenues from all the different sources. The much larger operating budget is usually released in February, which gives GNWT departments roughly 2 months in order to be ready for the start of the fiscal year on April 1st. The operating budget surplus, which is whatever revenue is remaining after all of the department expenditures have been budgeted, this is used to fund the capital budget. So the GNWT certainly can borrow to invest in capital, but under the fiscal responsibility policy, at least half of that capital budget has to come from the operating budget surplus. So you'll see the rule here on the PowerPoint, which is that capital investment does require an operating surplus. So balancing operating expenses with capital investment. How do we do that? You've likely heard it said that there is an infrastructure gap in the Northwest Territories as compared to the national averages. And this is because there is both less infrastructure and it's also often older than what you see across the rest of Canada. Cost sharing with the federal government means that small investments by the GNWT can result in fact, large returns in terms of what we can deliver in our capital plan. But again, the GNWT does need those operating surpluses in order to take advantage to invest our part. If the federal government puts in 75 cents on the dollar, 25 cents certainly stretches much further, which is a better deal than the 50-50 that you typically see from provinces. However, on a large project, it's worth keeping in mind that 25% can still be a significant amount of money. Some infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier, is necessary in order to deliver our programs and services. For example, schools are obviously needed to educate people. Water treatment and sewage facilities are needed in communities, and healthcare facilities to deliver healthcare programs. Other infrastructure will not only support residents directly through our various programs and services, but can also support business growth and economic growth in general. For example, here would be transportation infrastructure, airports and roadways. The challenge is to manage our revenues and our spending on the programs and services so that we continue to have sufficient surpluses and resources in order to address the capital needs. You'll note here the bullet on trade-offs. There are trade-offs between the different types of infrastructure as well. We have to ask ourselves whether we want to take some calculated risks and support some big projects, which might potentially deliver large-scale and longer-term economic growth, or focus on smaller projects that can have perhaps a stronger but shorter-term impact. A few words now on COVID-19 impacts. The operating surpluses that we're seeing here, that we're showing here on the slide, are indeed lower than expected. So COVID-19 has caused, as I mentioned earlier, our fiscal outlook to deteriorate. Compared to the projections we had at the time of Budget 2020's delivery, our revenue is down, our expenditure is up. As a result, this reduces the projected operating surplus. You can see the white bars are what we were projecting in Budget 2020, whereas the blue bars are where we're at right now. So taking into account the changes in our revenue, which have gone down, the changes in expenditures, which have gone up, what we are now projecting is in fact a significantly lower surplus for the coming year and for the next few years. The greatest decrease indeed is the current year and then following. We are fortunate to have the Territorial Formula Financing Grant. This comes from the federal government and in fact makes up approximately 70% of our total revenues. It partially offsets the losses we're experiencing this year as a result of COVID-19. Over time, revenue declines that we're projecting at this year and particularly next year will mean higher grants in the next 4 years. It's also worth noting that the federal government has provided additional funding to help the GNWT coping with COVID-19 related expenses, which has also lessened the impact of COVID-19 on our fiscal situation. And despite the global pandemic, which has resulted in these higher expenses and lower revenues, the GNWT does still project more revenue than what it spends on its programs and services. That operating surplus will allow us to continue to invest in much needed infrastructure. That said, we have to remember that there is in fact very little wiggle room and we may need to indeed continue to increase our borrowing and our debt in order to fund capital projects. And our current levels of borrowing simply are not sustainable over the long term. If we were to keep it up, we would hit our borrowing limit even with the recent increase. So, on to the next slide about the capital plan in more detail. The capital plan will require, as I've said, increases in operating surpluses. If surpluses cannot be maintained or indeed restored, the capital plan will need to be revised and brought down to be a lower. The budget here is year over year. The budget you see for the capital plan is year over year, but in fact the capital plan itself looks at long-term needs over a 20-year period. In the slide, the capital plan is shown in the white bars, and it is much greater than the operating surpluses that we are projecting right now, which are shown in the blue bars. The level of projected surplus simply does not meet that fiscal responsibility policy I mentioned earlier. That was the guideline that says that at least half of the capital plan needs to come from a surplus. In other words, based on that policy, we don't have enough money in our surpluses right now, projected surpluses right now, in order to invest in the capital that we expect to be needing over the next 20 years. So, what can we do? Four options here. To improve the fiscal outlook would require taking steps to either increase our revenues or reduce expenditures, or both. Tax increases would have a limited effect because, as I mentioned earlier, approximately 80% of the GNWT's budget in fact comes from federal transfers. So there would have to be fairly significant tax increases in order to generate a meaningful amount of revenue. And now, while borrowing may well seem like a tempting way to avoid any reductions in our expenses, it is not a sustainable option over the long term, not for capital and certainly not for operational expenditures that we need to budget for year over year. As we have funded capital for many years using partial debt financing already. And as a result of that, this is what causes the overall debt to grow and become elevated. Certainly, you can't continue to grow that indefinitely. Debt accumulation simply is not a viable path that we want to rely on. Now, at this point, I'm going to take a pause. We do have some questions that we're hoping that people are thinking about. But if there's any questions at this point on the first section of the presentation with regards to how the budgets are structured, how the budgets are functioning, and the interaction between them, I'm happy to take them. Or if people want to provide some input on the questions we have here, then we're certainly happy to do that. I see we have, let's see, at least one question so far. That's great. So first question, if you are having problems finding funding for a capital plan, wouldn't it make more sense to have a more realistic plan? That's a great question. So the way that the capital plan is developed, the long-term capital plan is developed, takes a fairly detailed level of assessment over what kinds of needs they're existing across the Northwest Territories. So it's a risk-based assessment and takes into account public needs as well as the planning per department in order to deliver the programs and services. So for instance, under the educational capital plan, they would actually have a system of an inventory system that looks at what are the educational components, what are the educational needs, what spacing is required to actually deliver early childhood and early child care, what spacing is required to have appropriate gym facilities. And then as the infrastructure, the schools age, that's continually assessed and continually revisited to try to ensure that across the territory, there's an adequate level of infrastructure, educational infrastructure across the whole territory. So, that's the kind of trade-off that I'm talking about earlier, where when we say that there's a trade-off, maybe it means that there's 3 or 4 communities right now that could all use either a school renovation or possibly a new school. We can't do them all in 1 year. Can we do them all over 5 years? Can every single one of them have a state-of-the-art computer room? That's exactly the kind of trade-offs that we're trying to fund. So the plan itself is quite detailed and has a lot of assessments in it. The simple fact is you're right that if there's not the funding to deliver on it, then at some point then it just doesn't happen. But then what does that do to our economy, and what does that do to the economic future if we're not able to deliver on those capital projects? So, and I think we have one more coming in. Yes. Why doesn't the GNWT release their upcoming 3-year capital plan? Okay, so we there are releases that are done. So the releases, this year's capital plan is going to be coming out in the fall. And I think that information actually is online. You know what? I will have to double check on what is available online. I suspect there's actually a fair bit of information, and I'm looking at someone in the room who's saying that they may be able to provide a link actually to that information that's online. So hopefully that's going to come in the chat side here, where you can actually get a link that will take you to it and take you to the information that is available online that will help answer that question for you. Okay. All right, another one, can we take a look at doing what Alberta and the US are doing, funding the parents of students from K to 12, rather than funding school authorities on a per student basis? Okay, homeschooling, microschooling, charter and private schooling, all set to take off in Alberta. And yes, so we've had an Auditor General's report here in ECE that certainly has come back saying that there's some unfavorable results. So I feel a major change in how we educate people is now due. Yeah, so that's a lot of fantastic information, and I'll just pause for a second to say that this obviously this is the Department of Finance that's leading this initiative right now. But when we do budgets involve every single department, involves all of cabinet, and all of the information that we're gathering, every comment that comes in on the chat line and all of the information we're getting on the survey that's available online, that is something that is going to be looked at by all of our senior members, senior deputy ministers, as well as all cabinet members. So when you're giving information like this about education, which certainly goes a little beyond where I might look at from economics and budgets and finance, be assured that when it comes to policy questions like this, that will go over to EC&E as well. But in the meantime, yes, so recognizing that there's questions around how we fund and what you're looking at, I do think there actually are some options in terms of the kinds of funds that are available, and there is a division between EC&E and then what's happening at the district level. So this is a little bit more of a complicated question, but one that I think what I may even do is send this one over to EC&E. So if you do want to share your contact information, we'd certainly be able to get back to you with a little more detail. And as far as how we are funding education, I'm just trying to make sure I don't miss anything in your question. Yeah, the funding of a per student basis, that has certainly come up. It's come up in discussions already. And so again, I think EC&E is conscious and aware that that's not the only way and that there may be, in fact, be better ways. Okay. All right. So I don't have anything coming in else at this point. We've got 2 more sections to go. And the next one is really looking at our revenue side. So one way to improve our fiscal outlook is to increase revenues. Now, how do you do that? We should keep in mind that there is a weak connection between our economy and GNWT revenue. And that's simply because of the way that we're structured with our fiscal connection to the federal government. Again, approximately 80% of the budget comes from federal transfers. But taxes and fees are 2 areas where the GNWT can and does exercise some control. Again, there are always trade-offs and there are things that we have to balance, such as competitiveness and the cost of living. So as I noted at the beginning of this slide, there's that weak connection because, again, the size and the nature of the arrangements we have at the federal government are a significant factor. Let me come back to that for a moment and explain here. When I'd said it was 80%, again, 70% of that comes from the Territorial Formula Financing, or TIF. Our small population, small economy means we simply don't have the ability to generate enough revenues on our own in order to provide services at a similar or comparative level to what's happening in the provinces across Canada. And so the federal government provides financial support so that the GNWT can provide programs and services at a similar level and a similar rate to what's happening in the rest of Canada. And as I said, 80%, so that's 70. The other 10 or so comes from other federal transfers, one of the biggest ones being the Canada Health Transfer. But our own source revenues, these include personal taxes, corporate income taxes, fuel, carbon, tobacco, payroll taxes, fees and charges, and resource revenues. The GNWT works to maintain a competitive tax rate. This is to support the economy, encourage economic diversification and development. So we do want to try to keep tax rates comparable to provinces so that the tax rate doesn't become a deterrent, doesn't drive people away from living here, and doesn't drive businesses to being relocated elsewhere. So the economy and the tax base do limit those options to raise revenues, as again, we don't want to drive businesses away and we don't want to drive residents away. So on to the next slide. What can we do? Ways that we can increase tax revenue. Well, there's 2 options, two sort of broad options. First is to do economic growth approach, which is in other words really a way of increasing and expanding the tax base. If we have more jobs, well then we have more payroll taxes. We have greater personal income means higher rates on or higher returns on income taxes. More business activity means more business tax revenue. So this is where you have the same tax rate, but it's being charged to a larger base, and that therefore increases the revenue that you receive. The second option here, increasing taxes. So you can increase taxes by raising rates or raising fees, introducing new taxes or new fees, or a combination of both new taxes and new fees. So here we wouldn't necessarily need to increase the number of payers as you would under the economic growth option, but you'd be asking some or all of those groups to pay more. I'm going to go into each of these options further on the next couple of slides. Let's start first with increasing revenue through economic growth. Here's how growth in the Northwest Territories economy and population could result in higher revenues. Growth in the economy and population results in higher revenues because, simply put, there's more people or more businesses paying those taxes. But keeping in mind, own source revenues are a small amount of the overall revenues. Even significant economic growth would still amount to only a small growth in tax revenue because it's still a small population that's paying. The biggest increase in revenues through economic growth would come from what would hopefully be an associated growth in population. Each new resident represents approximately $39,000 in additional TIF grants. So if we have a growth in our economy and a growth, then you would hopefully find that you'd have a growth in population as people are coming here to fill the jobs and fill that market. But growth in tax revenues is limited by two things here. One, leakages. Leakages is where, although there's increased economic activity, the money that you're earning can actually leak out. And this can be, for example, through importing of goods, where we still have to spend money in southern jurisdictions in order to buy a lot of things, or by having a lot of non-resident labor who then return to their home provinces, which is where they pay their taxes. And the second reason that constrains this growth is that tax-based growth can reduce federal transfers. And what that means is there's a partial clawback in federal transfers under the TIF, the Territorial Formula Financing, which makes up, again, our inability to generate enough funds and therefore the ability or the need for having federal funds. Well, that's limited, or that kind of goes down if in fact we are generating more own source funds. So if we are increasing our own source funds, we need less money coming from the federal governments. And as a result, the TIF transfers will go down. So the second option that you'll recall was increasing revenue through tax increases. Now, a few facts about the GNWT tax system. The GNWT would get to keep 100% of tax rate increases and new taxes because the federal territorial formula financing simply does not penalize tax effort. So it actually provides us an incentive to increase our own source revenues. You'll note here, the NWT has no sales tax, as we are all no doubt aware, but a sales tax, it's worth noting, is one of the biggest sources of tax revenue in the provinces, aside from Alberta, which is the only province that does not have one. If the GNWT wanted to increase a new tax revenue, 2% harmonized sales tax would raise approximately $20 million in revenue. But here's the trade-off. It would also raise overall Northwest Territories prices by approximately 1.4%. And while that might not be a large percentage, we do want to keep in mind that we do already have a very high cost of living, particularly in some of the smaller communities. GNWT tax rates, other than on tobacco and liquor, are at near or below the national average. Tobacco and liquor taxes of note, those markups are in fact among the highest in Canada. A few more notes on taxes before I go to the next slide. Personal income tax. This makes up approximately 5% of total GNWT revenues. The GNWT, or the Northwest Territories, has a progressive income tax structure. What that means is that as your personal income increases, your tax burden increases. And that's done by putting a higher tax rate on higher levels of income, which is your tax bracket. The general corporate income tax, which makes up approximately 1% of our total revenues, is close to the national average. And of note, companies can structure their businesses to allocate their income, particularly in investment income, to other jurisdictions in order to get the most competitive advantage. Resource revenues can also be increased, but here too, fiscal effects are likely to be minimal. Net resource revenues are in fact less than the 1% of our total revenue. And there is already a fairly high cost for remote exploration and mine development. Adding costs on this sector may well discourage any new exploration and new mines, and could in fact reduce the life of existing mines by reducing their profitability. So that's the end of section 2, discussing revenues and taking a look at how revenues work. Happy to take any questions about the own source revenues, about taxes, about economic growth, or anything that relates to how we might increase or change their own source revenues. Or if you wanted to make a comment on these questions, again, all of these questions are found on the survey, and they include those fancy little boxes where you don't just have to answer multiple choice. You can give us your comments. Okay, so we do have a few questions coming in, I am told. First one, if you are looking at increasing revenues, since we receive a transfer payment of approximately $30,000 or $39,000 per person, why not put a kids bonus in for anyone moving to the Northwest Territories? For example, if a couple with 2 kids comes, you can receive $120 per approximately. Why not give 10 per thousand per child bonus per year? It would be a good incentive to move here. That is an interesting idea. I have honestly not heard that before. Yeah, I think I'm just going to go with that's a really interesting idea. I don't know that I have a personal reaction to it right now. I think that's somewhat, frankly, that's exactly the reason we're doing these consults, is so we can hear ideas like that. You know, what's interesting is something that we heard a lot yesterday was people asking about how to increase population and talking about immigration, which, you know, and at the risk of giving away what's coming next, we do talk later about the fact that in the past there have been some efforts to incentivize people to move north and to increase population growth, and they haven't borne fruit. But you know, surely there's other ideas out there. There's always other ideas out there, and so yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that one. We'll definitely go away and give that one some thought. So thanks for that. Okay. With COVID, maybe we can attract more residents if more people are working online and where they live and work doesn't have to align. And there's a great link there to a story about, yes, I'm not going to click it right now because I'd never find my way back to the screen. And who knows, you'd be looking at me reading a story which isn't very interesting online. But I definitely will click on that. I'm a bit of a news hound, so happy to read that later. You know, and that is an interesting idea, and I'd also heard of it as it might make it easier for people who want to live in their home communities across the Northwest Territories if, in fact, you know, there's always a concern that large regional centres tend to have some of the positions, particularly the government positions. Maybe that won't matter so much if people are able to perform their work and function from whatever community they want to live in. So yeah, that is an interesting direction, and I certainly agree that we need to be paying attention to the disruptions that COVID is causing to economies and markets around the world, around Canada, so that we are at the front end of that and not responding to after the fact. Next one, how about reducing corporate taxes to encourage new business in the Northwest Territories? It's expensive to operate here, so just being competitive tax-wise still makes the North more expensive to operate a business here. Yeah, absolutely. I'm admittedly fairly new to the government sector myself, having spent most of my life on the private side, and my spouse still works on the private side. So it absolutely is expensive to operate a business, to explore, to try to innovate. There's just you know, a number of factors that make it more challenging here. And reducing corporate taxes is, you know, having said earlier that we're at or near the national average, the rates that we charge, particularly on small corporate income tax, is higher. It certainly is higher. Well, it's one of the highest in Canada, and we are certainly quite conscious of that. We being me in the Department of Finance is quite conscious of that. So a point taken and well heard. Thank you for that. And next one. Why not start the 2% sales tax to raise about $20 million annually for the GNWT? How do we balance the concern with the rise in cost of living that would entail? Yeah, that absolutely. That is exactly the trade-off and the balancing task. And that's, I'll say quite honestly, when I was reading the materials and talking with our policy shop about, and I saw that, you read the line of, wow, $20 million, 2%, that's not so bad. And then you realize that 2% equates to, frankly, almost a 1.5% rise in costs. You know, what are we really getting at the end of the day? We might getting money into the GNWT, but you're really impacting quite significantly on the population and on the cost of living and on the cost of doing business. And it gets into the conversation of, are we going to grow our revenues by growing our economy, which suggests where we don't want to necessarily have rising costs to individuals or rising costs on doing business. We want to incentivize and encourage people to go out and circulate those dollars in the North, in the economy, in the private sector, or do we want to grow our revenues by really getting those dollars into the GNWT? So that I think that is sort of a critical discussion to be had. But if you're looking to increase it from the economy side and not from the taxation side, then this certainly wouldn't be the way to go about it. But that's exactly why we want to have these dialogues, is to get a read as much as we can on what people are thinking. So I appreciate that. And does lowering taxes impact the TIF? I feel like this is somebody that's doing this to me almost to test me today. This is one of those, TIF is one of those difficult things that nobody, I was gonna say nobody understands, and that's not fair. Everyone struggles with TIF, and I've had to have about 3 briefings before I got comfortable with it. There's a complicated factor that goes into determining exactly the TIF amount. It's a whole mathematical equation, but lowering our taxes won't impact the TIF. It's an offset for the fact that we don't have the ability to raise our taxes, not for the fact that we're what our actual numbers are. There is some factor that comes in that if we're not at or near the average, that's right. So the average tax rate across Canada does factor in. So the further off we are from the average tax, that does impact the TIF. But I wouldn't worry. The actual dollar impact is not going to be significant. So that's, I appreciate that question, but that is not one that, it wouldn't be a reason to not lower taxes to be worrying about TIF, in short. Okay, good. So it looks like we might move on to the next section. Right, and this is the last section. So the last section is really the high-level, broad look at the economy and how that impacts and influences on budgeting. Economic growth can lead to higher own source revenues through expanded tax bases. So that we made that point earlier, but, and again, here's those trade-offs that I keep talking about. The control that the GNWT has over the territorial economy is limited. So we don't have total control. We don't just simply get to say we want to grow the economy and can make it magically happen. That said, the GNWT certainly has a role to play, and an important role to play. I want to start off with some observations here about our labor force. As is noted in the slide, the small Northwest Territories labor force constrains our economic growth. And why? The resident labor force right now is expected to be relatively steady over the medium term. We're at about 23,000 people, and of that group, approximately 21,000 are employed. By contrast, the total employment in terms of employment available is over 26,000. What that means is there is a difference of about 5,000 individuals, and those positions are filled by non-resident workers. Those workers do not pay income tax in the Northwest Territories, but they do pay the 2% payroll tax. And parts of our economy depend on having those workers filling these positions and can't operate without them. The Northwest Territories economy is dominated by government and mining. So just looking at what the sectors of our economy that are the largest, territorial is resource extraction and public administration. The jobs mix in the Northwest Territories is rather heavily skewed to public administration at 7,200 jobs in public administration. It's by far the largest employer here in the Northwest Territories. Now, I'll just make a note that 7,200, that is not entirely the GNWT. This is including all public administration. So all the levels of government across from communities all the way up to the federal government. It's the grand total of public administration in the Northwest Territories. Of note, public administration and mining also happen to be some of the highest paying jobs in the Northwest Territories. Now, some good news about that fact, although there's just these 2 major large dominating sectors, both of these sectors are strongly linked to other economic sectors and industries, such as construction, transportation, and the service industry and service sector. What that means is that these 2 sectors have strong impacts on other parts of the economy, so that the dollars that are being earned in those 2 sectors then continue to circulate around in the economy in those others, again, for example, in construction or in transportation. Also, from the public administration side, the sheer size of the government means that government actions and policies have strong impacts around society, on labor, and ultimately on the entire economy. That makes it has a multiplying effect. So we're going to take a moment and look at things we can control as well as things we cannot control. Starting perhaps with the sort of bad news of what we can't control. What we can't control here, there's 3 items of, for example, global demand for Northwest Territories non-renewable resources. The development of the resource base is dependent on world prices, the health of the national and global financial systems, other countries' policies, and other factors, quite frankly, such as COVID-19. And these are not necessarily things we can predict, or certainly not things we can control. The second example is international tourism. Here I would say we have limited control. Right now, international travel has collapsed given the health concerns and travel restrictions that are in place around the world and certainly across Canada. And then certainly for the short term, no amount of international marketing is going to change those current realities. Unfortunately, it's also not known and no way of knowing when in fact that might significantly change. And the third thing over which we have, at least again, limited control is our population. The Northwest Territories continues to have a small population and, as a result, a small labor force and a small tax base, all of which contributes to our inability to have strong impacts on own source revenues and economic generation. And as I mentioned earlier in response to one of the comments, there has been efforts made over time to try to increase this population with targets set, for example. But unfortunately, unfortunately or not, the population tends to remain fairly stable over time. And as a result of that, economic growth does continue to benefit both our fly-in and fly-out workers at least as much as our resident workers. But on to the better news, what we can control. Government, as I said earlier, is still a major player. There are levers we can pull and things that we have to and be considering and ways we need to be finding opportunities to pull those levers. There are certainly many actions that government can take that will have a direct impact on its citizens and on businesses. And there's also significant things that government can do that can have an indirect influence, whether that's, or in particular, if that's by supporting a positive atmosphere where people and businesses can make effective and productive choices that will in fact contribute to the economy and grow the economy. So we have some examples listed here on the slide. Physical infrastructure. This includes roads and airports, libraries, health centers, housing, and can have both, and of course will have both direct and indirect influences on people, on residents, on attracting residents, and on businesses, both in terms, again, of attracting businesses and keeping them. Programs and services, well, again, education, child and elder care, economic development opportunities. Public utilities, again, both direct and indirect, such as water and electricity. Our regulatory schemes, environmental, consumer protection, business regulation, and taxation. So again, we want to ensure we are providing a tax system that creates good conditions for growth and to be competitive while still generating our own source revenue in an equitable way. So that's the end of the broad third section, and we do have, again, a number of questions that we've written in here that are in the survey or that we're happy to take some feedback or comments on now. Or if anyone had any questions about the labor situation, the labor stats that we've included here, population growth, economic growth generally, and some of the ways that government can or can't control what is happening in the economy and the direction that we may want to see our economy go. So we'll see if we have any questions coming in, and maybe while you're all typing, I'm going to have some water. Okay. As a business owner, finding staff, sometimes we need to move people here. Why not help us with a relocation payment? For every new person we bring, there could be a transfer payment for the GNWT, and this would be another way to increase population. You know, I have to say, interesting, it's sort of this the sleeper topic that certainly does seem to be about growing population, which I will admit probably wasn't what I was expecting to find to hear a lot of feedback on, but it's consistent. Both yesterday and today, we're hearing a lot of actually great ideas, questions, but also great ideas of ways that we can incentivize folks to move here and ways to incentivize business owners to bring folks here. And I'll play the other side for a moment and say we also want to be keeping in mind that we're growing that skill set amongst our own population. So finding that balance between bringing up folks, which I'm certainly conscious of the $39,000 that comes with that on the TIF, but then also finding ways to balance that by ensuring that our own residents have that same skill set and are filling those gaps. So but the idea of having an incentive here, earlier the comment was around I think a direct incentive, and here's the business side. So even right now our immigration is run both through EC&E and through ITI. So there is an awareness that there's potentially different streams by which people are coming up. So that's definitely an interesting idea, and thank you for that. Okay, while I agree that government is a major client to most businesses in the Northwest Territories, there is also a lot of contracts that go to Southern companies. The BIP program of 15% is nothing when you consider the cost of doing business. It's time to increase that, maybe change policy to ensure that GNWT money stays with Northwest Territories companies, especially now with COVID-19. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so that's a very specific example of the percentage not being sufficient and considering the cost of doing business, which is high and is probably different, higher or perhaps slightly lower depending on the industry you're in, but for some it can be quite significant. So addressing BIP, ensuring BIP that is actually responsive and is actually accomplishing the goal that it's meant to set out is something that's on the mandate for the 19th Legislative Assembly. And doing a procurement review that includes a review of BIP is underway. That is going to happen in the life of this government. And I say the life of this government, but really I think COVID-19 shows that there's an urgency to that. And if we didn't feel it before, COVID-19 certainly makes it very apparent. I guess so let me just see. The thing there is to, a starting point is what is really to me is one of the starting points is what is the policy that we're trying to achieve? What is it we're trying to do here? And if we want to grow our private sector, support our private sector, and still deliver good infrastructure projects using public dollars, that's the goal we need to be finding our way to. So happy to have that come in, and again can assure you that procurement shared services and procurement overall is all something that we'll be paying special attention to now. Okay. Any concern with being able to continue the GNWT's high credit rating? Sorry for my sort of excited reaction there. If you were following the news, you certainly would have seen that Moody's has kept our credit rating where it was, which is second to the top, which is certainly good news. At the same time, I'm conscious that the federal government's rating was moved, and although our credit rating is kept high right now, it's being kept high right now, but there's always a concern, and we have to continue to be able to deliver those surpluses to maintain the fiscal responsibility policy that allows us to invest carefully in the capital plan. It's all those steps that have kept our credit rating where it is. But if we start to have to rely too much on borrowing and aren't able to deliver in terms of a long-term economic growth potential, then we're certainly going to have trouble. So we need to find a way to start turning the tide on the economic growth so that over the next 5 to 10 years, there's a sense of growth here and not a sense of stagnation. So short term, I'm not concerned, but long term, that's exactly why we're having this conversation now. Many Northerners are leaving because the cost of utilities are high. Okay, could the GNWT look into more renewable resource options and modern technology to reduce costs? Burning diesel is not economical. No, burning diesel is not economical. It certainly is. Go ahead and just say it's not really the way of the future. But unfortunately, a lot of our infrastructure around utilities right now is set up in a way that is, sadly, in so many communities, is the only option. And it's not just a question of turning a switch and switching from a diesel setup to being pellets or hydro or a small-scale hydro. There's an infrastructure component that goes to making those changes so that you're actually changing the source and actually changing the way that the utilities are set up in the communities and in homes and in businesses, etc. So Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, and that there is already a strategy underway and existing between multiple departments, and to do exactly this, is to look at how do we get communities off diesel, and how do we do that in a way that's hopefully going to bring those costs down. But making those changes comes with costs itself. So that is likely to be a huge challenge that comes over the next few years, is figuring out how to change, looking into the future, but still actually being conscious of the costs. And that is probably an area where indeed the government will, that's a kind of a good example of where the government has to play a role, because waiting on consumers to bear that burden is not likely to be realistic, certainly not in the short term as we're making those changes. Let's see here. Oh, is there going to be an Indigenous procurement program put in place? Well, if you, I don't know if you had a chance to see the news yesterday, but procurement has, there's been some changes in procurement in terms of departmental placement announced only yesterday. So it's going to be a little bit early for me to go on any limbs and say exactly the direction of procurement review, given that there were some changes in the government setup around responsibility for procurement. But let me certainly say that I do think the way we do procurement in the North is a critical opportunity and a key opportunity to make sure that we are truly delivering on, the government's role in the economy, the government's role to support the growth of the economy, and that doing so with Indigenous governments and some of the Indigenous Development Corps. This is really a way where the Northwest Territories, I think, can be a leader and can distinguish ourselves in Canada of showing how to do this in a way that really promotes growth for the future. So, I think there's a lot of hope here, and I'm pleased to see that coming in as one of the pieces of feedback. Let's see. Okay, look at post-secondary education as an opportunity to grow our population. Even if the students don't bring in federal transfer payments, they'll be spending money in the community for at least 8 months of the year. That will grow businesses and grow employment. Build a campus for Aurora College in the YK. It's the only campus community without one. And from a financial perspective, international students don't cost the GNWT versus territorial national students who get a subsidy from the GNWT. Look to offer programs that are unique, like mining, and we can compete with the University of Colorado. Okay, yeah, there's a lot there. So I think Minister Simpson will be getting a message from me later today, because we've had a couple of great comments that fall within EC&E for sure. And I think there is a really strong vision right now that has been developed and that is in the process of being fleshed out for transforming post-secondary education in the Northwest Territories. That has been a strong message over the last year, and the call to do that and to do that differently is not new. And there's also a really strong set of messaging coming out of ITI's folks around the knowledge economy and where does that fit in for our future in the Northwest Territories. How can we use some of the unique things that are across the Northwest Territories? For example, like our mining and mineral resource sector, geology more broadly, but really across the spectrum of industries and across the spectrum of potential studies, that there's a lot to offer here. And if we can tool ourselves up to be a destination place, you're quite right, that'll potentially increase population, potentially create an opportunity within the educational sector, and really distinguish us. So yeah, thank you for that comment. That's great. Increase O&M to communities, and then they can hire more staff. Local employment. 23 of 33 communities are underfunded. You could increase funding for small communities and create jobs. Win-win, and meets 2 of your mandate goals. You've taken the wind out of my sails. I was just about to say, yes, this is in our mandate, both in terms of reducing the fact that there is a gap in municipal funding. That is in the mandate quite clearly, and some commitments have been made in that priority document. And yes, similarly, increasing economic or opportunity, increasing employment in small communities. Again, you're right, also in the mandate. But also in the mandate is the item of increasing regional decision making. So I'll still add one more in here to this comment, that there's still one more mandate item that I think is impacted, that if we can empower our communities more so that they can make decisions. I mean, we're a very large territory, which I think provides a lot of opportunity, but it also means we need to be looking for folks who are in those communities, spread out as they are, to be really driving the sectors that work for them. Lobby the feds to implement Truth and Reconciliation call to action number 21, the Indigenous Healing Centers with sustainable funding. That'll create jobs and is so important socially. Yeah, I mean, all of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action are so important socially and politically and economically. I think this is, the sooner we can start to look at some of the recommendations that are there and recognize that by achieving and taking steps meaningfully towards reconciliation, I think this is actually going to, the Northwest Territories is a great example of a place where we will see growth in our population, growth in our ability to deliver on labor, growth in our economy, because it speaks to so many important things. So I definitely appreciate this, this particular comment, an Indigenous Healing Centre, which in some ways goes back to the last comment just before about increasing the regional decision making, because an Indigenous Healing Centre needs one that is that responds to the communities that it's meant to serve. So yeah, that's a big one actually, but it's a very important one. So thank you. And diamond mining isn't as strong as it used to be, and the suspension of Ekati has reduced some of the taxes that the GNWT would receive. How will budget 2021 reflect that shortfall in tax revenue, and where else will those taxes come from? So, well, I don't have the breakdown in front of me, but the slide that you had earlier where it showed the reduction in our projected revenues already for 2020, I'm fairly certain does actually include modeling of the closure of Ekati and the impact that that's going to have on our revenues. So, and that, again, I believe. And that projection, those projections of having one of those mines closed have factored into the revenues that we are seeing, the reduction in revenues that we are projecting now, not only this year, but also already projecting into 2021. So again, because the projections that are being done, I mean, they're projections, they're exactly that. But they do certainly need to be done in advance so that we can continue to do planning continuously as capital plans get developed and as capital needs get assessed. And earlier I think I mentioned that I'm just going to draw the number out of my head and hope for the best with it, but that corporate taxes produce only 1% of our actual revenue. So fortunately, in this case, although we want to grow the economy and have a larger private sector, for the moment, that tax revenue is only 1% of the actual revenue budget. So it's not going to have as dramatic of an impact. Where I think the bigger issue, though, is the indirect effects from having a closure and how that affects the subcontractors, how that affects, having money in the hands of folks who then circulate that money within our communities. So does it impact the GNWT's direct revenue budgets? No. Does it impact our communities? Yeah, significantly. So that's where, we certainly are hopeful that the mineral resource sector will continue to be strong and grow stronger over time, because it's a major impact on our economy. Sorry, I've got more questions coming in and I'm going on. Okay, settle land claims. It'll increase employment at Indigenous governments. Absolutely. And once again, this is very high on the list in terms of the mandatory, or in terms of the mandate and priorities. This is in the mandate document. It is in the priorities. And I am quite certain that, and it's not a new recognition that this is something that simply must happen. And again, it benefits all of the Northwest Territories, and you're quite right. It impacts employment, it impacts economies, it creates opportunities. So point well taken. Next one, GNWT should devolve commissioners' land in communities to communities. Making communities apply for land within their boundaries slows down economic development. It also means that there are a bunch of employees reviewing all of these applications, redeploy them to other work. Okay, so there's a few things in there. Let me focus on the devolving of commissioners' land in communities to communities. Again, that certainly has been raised. I know it's been raised by our friends over at the NWTAC on behalf of communities, and I think this is one where I'll probably copy paste this one over to Minister Thompson, who's involved with lands and with ENR. And I'm quite confident that this is something he's talking about and finding ways to ensure that that those opportunities are available to the communities, so they can make them available to the people in those communities as being an economic opportunity. Okay. Has there been thought given to how to not further stress an already known issue of housing with both aging homes and lack of available land for new homes? So I can say I know the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation is very much conscious and aware of the fact that increasing housing stock in general is important here in the Northwest Territories, but also doing so across the spectrum of housing. So if you look at housing and you look at the spectrum as being everything from addressing and supporting homelessness to people who are in transition up to market housing, there's a real spectrum, and we in the Northwest Territories need all of it and more of it, and we needed it last year. So yes, I do think there's a lot of pressure there and a lot of awareness of how to solve that problem. Again, I think that is another mandate item. And it's how do you deliver that and where do you start? But it has to happen. And so, yes, I think there's definitely an awareness of that. I think there'll be more coming out, as I say, from the Housing Corporation in the not too distant future. They have certainly got a significant portion of a capital plan. Okay. All right. Okay, so yes, there's oh right, and so that I see this is coming in the comments section from one of the moderators, but I should mention it that comments that are coming in. So if folks are responding as we're speaking and perhaps responding to comments or questions that came earlier, if they're not finding their way into the comments that are being published, that doesn't mean they're not being logged. That doesn't mean they're not being kept. Sometimes I think if the conversation has moved on or if the question's sort of been answered, you might not see your comment or your question coming up in the published list. That doesn't mean we're not receiving it. It may mean that we've got multiples that are similar, or again, if for whatever reason, if it's a really lengthy comment, the moderators might pull that one out. But comments are all being kept, all being saved. I'm going to read them all, and they will all be part of what gets factored in when the What We've Heard report gets put together. And as I think I said earlier, the What We Heard report, again, being somewhat new to the government, I sort of do but what do you do with a What You Heard report? I can tell you what I intend to do with a What You Heard report, which is first of all to read it, to take it quite seriously. But I've also already talked to my colleagues on cabinet about the fact that this is a document that's going to benefit every single one of us. This fall we go into our capital planning initially, but we're also going into business planning. And one thing that we are doing differently as of now, as of Budget 2020, we are shifting from a 1-year business planning process for departments to a 4-year business planning process for departments. If that doesn't sound like a big difference, trust me, it is. And if it does sound like a big difference, hopefully it's good news that the government is going to try to think in a way where we can deliver our programs and services, the growth and the development of our programs and services in more than just 12-year chunks. So it really is, I think, going to help with a lot of planning and more effective use of our resources, and have a bit more vision of how we want to get, because sometimes it takes more than 6 months to develop something. So with a 4-year plan, we have a much better opportunity to do that. What should residents expect to see in the next budget? Oh, goodness. Well, that depends an awful lot on what we hear in our budget dialogue sessions and in the What We Heard report. So yeah. There's always going to be the set programs and services that remain. I mean, there's core things that the government has to deliver: healthcare, education, some fundamental transportation infrastructure. But there's always opportunity, I think, to try and to show the shift in direction that we're trying to go. And I know this government's talked a lot about relationships, building on relationships, and strengthening people. So I think there's been that already, that sign of of being fiscally responsible and being creative with what we have. So certainly I think those themes will remain. And as far as any specifics go, again, the What We Heard report that we're putting together here is going to be part of business plans, and business plans are now looking at the next 4 years. As far as one thing I guess I'll mention about the next budget is, something that we've already done here in finance. The Department of Finance houses within it what's called the Management Board Secretariat, MBS. And these are the folks that, as departments bring their financial requests in, MBS do an analysis to look at, really what kind of requests they are, how is that money being spent, ensuring that really the spending of the GNWT meets the needs of residents. And one thing we've done already and put in place for July 1st is that departments are expected to do a gender and identity analysis of how money is impacting different groups, different genders, different identity groups, to really ensure, it's essentially a gender-based budgeting, but if anything, a little bit broader. This is something that's been happening at the federal level for a little while now, and we wanted to bring it in to see that when we spend our money, that we're doing it and we're conscious of who we're impacting across the territories. You've mentioned disruptions, creating opportunities a couple of times. Okay, yes. What kinds of opportunities do you see as we emerge from the pandemic? Yeah, I have mentioned disruption. I mean, I think, the idea of disruption can have a negative connotation or it can have a positive connotation. And the pandemic is one where, there's certainly been a great deal of stress and strife and personal tragedy, and we're not through it yet. Cases are still rising, exponentially in the States, it seems, and rising still across Canada. And there's still community spread happening across Canada. So although I know there's some folks are still quite frustrated a bit with the fact that we're under restrictions here, that pandemic is far from over. So with that in mind, the kinds of opportunities we see, the one that I'm going to give an example of, and it's an example only because, again, part of doing this dialogue is to actually hear what opportunities you see. But one example is in the area of broadband and how we use this as an opportunity to really leverage advocacy voices across the Northwest Territories and really go into some interesting and creative opportunities to deliver programs, deliver services, and do things, whether it's online or with technology, in a way that's going to potentially, I think, open up the Northwest Territories without maybe some of the traditional infrastructure that is so costly and difficult to deliver. But that said, the government of the Northwest Territories isn't an internet service provider, so the way that we do that is still challenging. But we certainly do have a role in terms of the kind of services we can provide. I certainly see also the hospitality sector right now, although they've been hit really hard. There's a lot of interesting things happening in the hospitality sector. Certainly here in, speaking more from personal experience of what I'm observing in Yellowknife, there's some really creative moves happening within our hospitality sector, interesting marketing ideas happening. So, folks are responding to the challenge, and that's really exciting to see. It really showcases the best of the North and how resilient our population really is. Right, anything? Okay, I think I am told there's a few more things coming in. In the meantime, just what I might actually add, there's one more little note, tooting the finance horn. When I mentioned earlier about being creative and being effective and making sure we're spending our money in the best ways possible, we've actually internally, with internal funds, been able to double our ability to deliver on program evaluations and program capacity and program evaluations. So, and while that might not sound particularly exciting, I think it's actually really exciting, because if we have a set amount of revenues coming in and we're concerned about the balance between revenues and expenditures, we want to continue to deliver programs and services. We want to continue to meet the needs of residents. So not just delivering programs and services for the sake of it, but to actually be doing it in a way that meets needs. You want to be able to evaluate whether what you're doing is accomplishing the goal it's set out to do. So early on, that was something that we here in finance looked at and said, yes, absolutely. And departments need some support to do that. And so what we've done is doubled the capacity of our evaluation systems and program evaluation here in finance, so that we can better support departments to say, not just going about business as usual and doing the same program because that's the way you've always done it, but are you in fact accomplishing the goal that you want to accomplish with this program? So, these are some of the things that happen behind the scenes in government, but that I think actually in the course of short and medium term are going to have a big difference. And while that doesn't factor into a presentation like this, if we can deliver our programs in a way that accomplishes the needs that are out there and to do that more effectively, well, then that does impact our budget too, right? I have another question here. Maintain remote work option, even from outside the territory, considering that there is a COVID pandemic and COVID is here to stay. Okay, so so that was certainly the tension between returning everyone to work and returning everyone, particularly again, the GNWT, as I mentioned, public sector administration generally is a huge part of the labor force here. So there was a real push around, well, everyone should be back in their offices, both from the perspective of being better able to deliver on government services, as well as then, folks being downtown and maybe getting a coffee. And on the flip side, of course, is that, if the pandemic is certainly here to stay, or at least here, I'm hopeful over the short to medium term that we are going to have to continue to ensure, number one, is the safety of our employees, the health and welfare of our employees, and also the health and welfare and safety of the public that they serve. So those are all critical. That's a critical consideration always. And so while we do have a return to work plan in place right now, that return to work plan really is about responding to the fact that there was an emergency level exodus from the workplace, and not really one that was structured around a remote work policy or remote work structure. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to think, how do we look at productivity of our public service? How do we look at the public productivity of employees generally, and not just public service, but broadly speaking? How do you look at productivity? How do you measure that so that folks can have flexibility, so that we are an attractive employer, so that we can recruit and retain the best possible people to do the best possible job? And again, I know there's a real tension often, and it's not new. It's not a new tension between the private sector and the public sector. But I will say this, being again fairly new to the public sector, I've been nothing but blown away by the amount of people who have put in all kinds of hours to deliver programs and services throughout the pandemic under stressful times for themselves and their family. So, and the number one thing we were considering, aside from safety, in terms of the return to work plan, was really looking at, are the programs and services being interrupted? And if they were, priority was to get those folks back into a position where they could continue to deliver on those programs and services. So that's a much longer answer to a much shorter question. So sorry about that. Let me hit the next one. Don't let the GNWT employees work outside of the Northwest Territories. Oh, look at this, some discussion and debate online. How exciting. They need to be in the North to know what's happening and supporting local businesses. Yeah, so, well, I almost don't feel like I need to even answer this one. I feel like there's an interesting chat happening on the side, which, if there was one thing that I could say I'd be thrilled to see, it'd be if budget dialogues, which doesn't necessarily sound all that juicy, actually generates a back and forth debate like that. So thank you for sending that in. And there is, again, when I talk about a flexible workplace, I do come back to the fact that every person that's living in the territories comes with $39,000 price tag from the federal government. So, and often comes with family, sometimes comes and has a family when they get here. So, that is certainly a consideration to be had. And, I think there's sometimes some differences between the larger regional centers and the even smaller communities where building relationships and making connections is going to be very important to delivering programs and services and supporting local businesses. So yeah, thanks for the response and comment there. Okay. I'm not sure if we have any more. Oh, we got at least one more coming in. Are these kinds of sessions something you'll be doing regularly? And what are some other ways we can have input? So, I want to be, number one is I want to be flexible. And I really do believe that staying connected between a ministerial level and then, what is happening at the front lines and what is happening in private sector, it is critical to maintain connections and to hear input in different formats. And so sometimes that's going to mean these kinds of formats where I personally can see the comments coming in. That's fantastic. And I know that the comments that haven't made their way into the side certainly are going to be, again, part of the bigger analysis that goes on. I'd like to, I mean, I kind of want to say yes, we'll do some sort of session regularly. I guess I hesitate only because I don't know quite what it'll look like. We put this together fairly quickly. Back in the, I guess, winter now, there was some thought that we'd do a bit of a road show and go on the road and do these sessions. And obviously that's a bit challenging because it's hard to make those kinds of plans right now. But you know, I'd like to say that there'll be something like this happening fairly regularly. You know, today there's been a lot of comments and ideas. Yesterday there was actually quite a lot of substantive questions, which so you know, there's two parts to what we're doing now, and one of them is just to make it more clear as to how the government budget works, but one of them is to get feedback. So as to your second question, what are some other ways we can have input? Well, number one, there is the survey that is out right now. It is live. It is on the finance website. It has both some multiple choice options, but it also has, as I think I said earlier, the fancy boxes where you get to type in, you know, your own comments and ideas. I think you'll also see there Todd's email. There's directly. I'm sure he's thrilled that I'm throwing his name out on the internet right now, but you can email him directly if you are not someone who wants to fill out a survey, and he's you know, one of our moderators here today, and we'll also be collecting all of that, all of the input. You know, we're going to be getting the survey out into the government services offices. Not everyone's online. I mentioned earlier the need for better broadband. We're well aware of it, but the reality is it's not a switch. It's not something I get to turn on, and we can support point of contact into the communities, but broadband into homes, fiber into homes, we're going to need the private sector involved. So in the meantime, government services offices will be having copies of the survey. Yeah, I mean, if you have ideas about other ways that people should be able to put out input or provide input, I'm again quite happy to hear it. So we sort of did our best to scramble and come up with some alternatives, given the restrictions that are in place and given the need to make sure our communities stay safe. But I'm be thrilled to hear if there's better ways of communicating. Okay, and there, Todd, thank you for putting your email out into the world. That's wonderful. Everyone can send Todd their warm wishes and great ideas. And I think that's a wrap, everybody. So thanks very much for joining me. Merci beaucoup. Bon après-midi. Good afternoon to you all, and happy weekend.